Electricast.
This episode is brought to you by Audi. The road is calling. Embrace the thrill of the drive with the all-new, fully electric Audi Q6 e-tron. Featuring effortless power, serious acceleration, and advanced Audi tech. It's not just a new EV. It's a new way to experience driving. The all-new, fully electric Audi Q6 e-tron is here. The next chapter of Audi starts now.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. From your morning podcast to your afternoon playlist, State Farm knows you personalize your entire day. And that's why State Farm helps you personalize your insurance with the State Farm Personal Price Plan. It offers coverage options that help protect what you care about most at an affordable price just for you. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices vary by state. Options selected by customer. Availability and eligibility may vary.
This week on the Deep Leadership Podcast.
It's all the best ideas we have and the research we have that sort of has some tie or would contribute to how do we as human beings do our best work or do our best performance. And as you can imagine, that spans everything from athletics all the way into business.
Hi, and welcome to Deep Leadership. I'm your host, John Rennie. Well, the purpose of this show is to build a world with better bosses, and we do that by learning from the greatest minds in leadership today. Whether you're new to leadership or a seasoned pro, you're going to get practical advice to help you lead with confidence. Today's episode is brought to you by the Salty Sailor Coffee Company, Cadre of Men, and Pharaoh Skincare. Check out the show notes for all of my sponsors and links to purchase my books. Now, today we're talking about high-performance leadership, and my guest is Dr. Carla Fowler. Dr. Fowler is an expert in performance science, and she uses that expertise to help leaders reach the highest levels of performance. Now, if you're looking to step up your leadership game this year, you need to listen to this important interview. I love this discussion. I know you will as well. So, are you ready to dive in? Let's get started.
Welcome to Deep Leadership. Leadership is a people business. That's the philosophy of your podcast host, John Rennie. As a former Cold War submarine officer who spent 20 plus years leading businesses in corporate America before starting his own manufacturing business, he knows that leadership matters. Are you ready for some real-world actionable advice from John as well as his expert guests?
I'm ready.
The show starts right now.
Welcome to the Deep Leadership Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Carla Fowler. Carla is an MD, PhD, and elite executive coach. For the last decade, she has been a secret weapon for scores of CEOs, entrepreneurs, and other senior leaders. Carla's unique approach combines the latest research from performance science with timeless best practices to help top performers level up and achieve their goals. Now, if you want to be a high-performing leader, you need to understand performance science. I'm excited to have Carla here today to learn from her expertise. So Carla, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John. This is, I'm excited for our conversation.
I'm excited as well. And, before I press record, I said, you're a high achiever. And I'm interested in learning about your journey. So help us understand how you got to where you got to, because how do you go from an MD, a PhD, to now being an executive coach and building this executive coaching practice and then kind of focusing on performance science? So how did this all come about?
Well, definitely, we'll knock that high achiever just down a little bit. It was not all planned out. I did not, at the start, imagine that this is what I would be doing, that I'd be 12 years into an executive coaching practice and having sort of built a methodology and really gotten into performance science at a deep level. So, and I mean, this is the beautiful thing about our journeys is that wonderful stuff can happen and it can also be not your plan at all. Looking back, if I had to, with hindsight say, how did I get here and what were the forces at play? I think one of the big forces was just following what I was interested in. And I think a couple of things that came out pretty early in my growing up, maybe fifth grade, was I definitely was interested in how people went and got what they wanted in life. And also if they were performing at a high level, like in fifth grade, that looks like you won the track meet, right? I wanted to understand how people did that. And you could imagine psychologically that probably has something to do with like being a kid, wanting more control over like, what happens to you in life. But that was a really early interest and passion of mine. And so I was just this totally, I was a scientist very early, but a very observational one. So I was just watching the world around me, trying to like glean ideas and like see what other people were doing. And I think you could see that like that science brain continued. So I liked problem solving, like math and science came much easier to me than like the more kind of like freer forms of like English or history, those kinds of things. But I was always really socially oriented also, very interested in what people were doing. And so I think that's how I got into the like medicine and sort of biological science piece of things. That engineering wasn't quite my style. I think I wanted to be working with people, impacting people. And that also was a passion of mine, was this idea of really tangibly wanting to feel like, oh, okay, like something I'm doing is impacting someone in a positive way. And so I think I also knew like, well, you got to figure out what your path is in life. And I liked structure and I was good at climbing a ladder. And so, medical school is a great place for that. They define the hoops you have to jump through. There are test dates, clear deadlines. You get to study for this. And so there was a lot of like good things that really drew me into that. And I enjoyed medical school. I even like decided to do a PhD as well because there was like sort of additional financial aid for that. And also, I always thought, well, if learning one thing's good, if you could learn another like complementary way of thinking or skill set, well, that's even better because then you can kind of approach things from different angles. And I think that was the piece of me that also wanted to be a scientist, so not just a doctor, but say, well, do you understand, how to ask scientific questions and think about them? Now, right before we started the show, we were talking about how you were in your dissertation process and or your doctoral process.
Yeah, I'm just starting my dissertation. Yeah, so.
This is right. And one of the interesting things I thought when I started that compared to medicine was how much less structured it was. Like if med school is a ladder, like there's a lot of wandering around in the dark. I don't know what your experience is.
100%.
Like, PhD process.
I feel like I'm shooting arrows into the dark and hoping one hits the target once in a while. So yeah, interesting that you make that analogy. Yeah, I do feel a little bit like in the dark and hoping for the best. So yeah. But
so mostly I think I followed that passion for performance into these really challenging environments. And I liked that. I also loved physically challenging environments. So I was a big athlete. So in the background along all of this, like I was playing really high level sports. Like I competed in multiple national championships, won a world championship of ultimate frisbee while I was doing my MT, my PhD. But maybe the thing that is kind of buried under all of this was just this interest in like subjecting myself to all these different kinds of environments that were hard, that there was some achievement to be had. And because I was doing enough of them, I was doing them all quite imperfectly. It wasn't like I was doing a deep dive on just one thing. But that had some really interesting impacts on how I started to track patterns about performance across these different realms. And also like being able to realize that I wanted a really multi-channel life. I wasn't ever someone who could really like dive really deep in one thing and only do that one thing and imagine doing that one thing, for a very long time. And so perhaps you can hear what's coming, which is when I got into my residency doing general surgery, after I graduated from medical school, I realized that was going to be a lot of one thing. And also that there were a number of my strengths that weren't being utilized as much as I felt like they could be. A lot of the like things around interpersonal like connection and the ability to sort of work with patients around any number of things that when someone's sick, when they need surgery, like important conversations you might want to have. And so there was sort of this moment of saying, I enjoyed the whole ride here. And I also think like taking this career path all the way down to the end is not going to be right for me. And so I had to really sort of consolidate and say, what were the threads that you loved of all of this? And what have you been trained to do, aside from like knowing how to cut someone open and stitch them up? And is there a different career path or place that you fit where you can really use these things to help people? And to me, that was what pointed directly at like performance and coaching and using all of the training I got in medicine to really work with people around high stakes decisions or doing something that is challenging, like behavior change, that I could use and really port a lot of that, plus my interest in performance, and say there was a whole nother practice that could be formed here, just not a medical practice. And I like finished the year. Like I never like to let my team down. So I told them with some notice that I was not going to return. They should fill my spot, but finish the year. And then I left and went into the total wilderness of like starting a practice, building a methodology, and saying, there is a lot of wonderful performance science that with my science training, it's a different kind of science, but I can like access it and let's build something and let's see what I can make that's my own. And so that was 12 years ago, and plenty of like journey and learning. You know, they don't teach you how to build a business in medical school. So, so that is how I got into this. And it's been a wonderful ride. There are ups and downs. You know, you don't enjoy every moment of it, but really still love performance science, find it really useful in all sorts of places, leadership, whether you're a founder or, you know, within an established company, really wonderful impacts that I've seen it have for people over the years. So long story, but that is how we make that kind of transition.
Yeah.
Doctor to coach.
I absolutely love it. And it's interesting because we've had a lot of, different, people that have gotten into leadership coaching and what have you. And I do find a lot of, I run into a lot of engineers and science people who end up in this role. So it's kind of interesting. I trained as an engineer. And I love people, which is a strange, how did that happen? Right. And I don't know, I don't know if it's so much the science, but I just love people and I'm interested in personalities and I love when people figure out things and can people always surprise me with better performance than I expect or better ideas than I ever would have come up with on my own. So I've learned to just enjoy people, but I know I'm not. That's kind of a strange thing for an engineer to be sort of an extrovert and love people and love being around people. But I think maybe that science background and maybe that. You sort of like you're connecting the dots with people like you would, like processes and what have you. So maybe maybe you see patterns. Maybe I see patterns in people as I would in science. So it's kind of interesting that that many science people end up in the world of leadership performance. So it's very interesting. So it's not too unusual, but. Yeah, I mean, you being an MD and a PhD, it's pretty serious background you have coming into a role like this for sure. But for those listeners that don't really understand or know what that is, what exactly is performance science?
Yeah, this is a great place to start. It is a broad interdisciplinary field. And the way I define it is just to say it's all the best ideas we have and the research we have that sort of has some tie or would contribute to how do we as human beings do our best work or like do our best performance. And as you can imagine, that spans everything from like athletics all the way into business. So things that maybe are dominantly feel like a physical pursuit all the way to things that might more dominantly feel like a mental pursuit. But one of the really cool things about performance science is over time, even though it has its roots in athletic performance, there were a number of fields that picked it up relatively early. And I would say the military is one of them, but also even like surgery, like these fields that have a physical component to it, but very much a decision-making and a mental component to it. And then, of course, like that made a bridge into like business and business performance and leadership. And of course, we know now that business and leadership are not only mental. They are not only mental performance. Actually, like what is happening in our full body biologically matters a lot to how we make decisions. And of course, now go to the flip side, like on the athletic side, we know that athletics is not just about like how strong are your muscles, like that the mindsets and one's ability to think about and motivate and even like deal with change of plans. Like if your race is not going to plan, like what are you going to do in the middle of it? So I love the interdisciplinary nature of performance science. And I would say it has I break it down into saying it has about 4 big buckets. I just like to simplify things. And science is often overly academic and complex. And I am very much like a practitioner. I want to like make it applicable and very usable for people versus publish in an academic journal. Right. So if we were to simplify it, I would say that performance science has like 4 big buckets. And I think the first one is very much all the ways we can think about strategy or like focus. And so, for example, when we like as a leader are deciding what is most important for our like business or our company to be spending resources on to perform well in the market, to say what is our goal and what are the most important things we need to execute on or deliver on to get that. And maybe even more importantly, what are all the things we're not going to do? So this is just an example of like part of performance is deciding what you're trying to achieve and what's most important for that. So first big bucket, strategy. I think the second bucket is really about execution and sort of execution and influence, right? Like if you've decided what's most important for you to be doing or for your team to be doing, how well can they go do that? Sometimes influence is needed for that. Sometimes it's about skill or quality of execution. Sometimes it's about your processes. But there's first bucket, understanding what's most important. Second bucket, how well can you actually go execute that? And you could say that the productivity movement kind of falls in that second bucket. So again, a great familiar example of how is performance science kind of all out there with things that we have known and heard of or might be familiar with. Third bucket, I call it sort of the psychology or the mindset bucket. Probably has some sociology in there too. But it's all of the elements of how do we stay motivated? How do we build confidence to go do the things we've decided are most important to execute on those things? It has to do with like motivating a team through a challenge or a time of uncertainty. And so there's a lot of important pieces or mindsets that kind of exist in that psychological piece.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
This episode is brought to you by Cadre of Men. Leadership is a people business, and for men, real growth happens alongside those who challenge and inspire you. Cadre of Men is your force multiplier, helping you achieve more strength, deeper connections, and a stronger sense of purpose. I'm proud to call myself a member of this dynamic group. Cadre of Men is built for men who refuse to settle. With dedicated forums covering fitness, fatherhood, business, and more, we provide the tools and camaraderie to help you thrive. Our weekly Zoom calls dive into tough, real-world topics, often featuring expert guest speakers who will push you to sharpen your skills and mindset. Monthly meetups include intense hikes and hands-on building sessions where you forge bonds through shared challenges. From fitness and finance challenges to mastering public speaking, Cadre of Men delivers actionable curriculum in leadership, business, and personal growth. If you're ready to step up, push past your comfort zone and lead by example, Cadre of Men is for you. Inside the Cadre, we grow together, lead together, and rise together. Visit cadreofmen.com to learn more and take the first step toward becoming your best self. This episode is brought to you by Pharaoh Skincare. I would have never imagined I'd be talking about skincare, but this stuff is truly amazing. Pharaoh is revolutionizing skincare by replacing harmful chemicals with natural ingredients sourced from regenerative farms. Now, weightlifting is tough on the hands, and Pharaoh's Epic Dermis is the best product I've ever used to get my callous hands back to normal and stay in the game. Now I use it every day. Farrow also works to reduce fine lines, wrinkles, and improve overall skin health. As Farrow CEO Charles Mayfield likes to say, a little Farrow goes a long way. Deep Leadership Podcast listeners can save 15% off all of their products by using the code DEEP at checkout. So check them out at farrow.life. That's FARROW.life. This episode is brought to you by the Salty Sailor Coffee Company, the official coffee of the Deep Leadership Podcast. Salty Sailor is a veteran-owned coffee brand on a mission to deliver premium, fresh roasted coffee while making a positive impact in the world. Their motto is drink coffee and do good, which reflects their commitment to making amazing coffee and actively supporting the military community. 10% of every order goes to the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society, an organization dedicated to helping sailors, Marines, and their families in times of need. All our listeners get 10% off every order of their amazing coffee by using the discount code DEEP at checkout. So check them out at saltysailorcoffee.com.
This episode is brought to you by Bank of America. What if your business could see beyond what is and into what can be? And what if you had a partner as visionary as you are? Bank of America gives customers access to trusted experts, real-time insights, and digital tools to make every move matter. What would you like the power to do? Visit bankofamerica.com/banking for business. Bank of America is proud to be the official bank sponsor of FIFA World Cup 2026.
I think you're on mute.
Workday starting to sound the same?
I think you're on mute.
Find something that sounds better for your career on LinkedIn. With LinkedIn Job Collections, you can browse curated collections by relevant industries and benefits, like flex PTO or hybrid workplaces, so you can find the right job for you. Get started at linkedin.com/jobs. Finding where you fit. LinkedIn knows how.
The last bucket, I call it like the biology or the physiology bucket. And that's because, what is happening in our bodies, what hormones are coursing through us. Are we stressed and having a lot of adrenaline? Are we calm and relaxed? Have we slept? Have we gotten enough sleep lately? We know all these things totally impact our decision-making, our motivation. And so that's that fourth bucket. And so imagine all these buckets, they all impact each other. And they can all feed on each other to make like upward cycles. And they can also feed on each other to make downward cycles. And, but I love performance science and feel like it's important for leadership and for us as individuals because it actually gives us a way to start to systematically break down challenges or problems or even goals to help us have a way to approach those things as opposed to just saying, well, we all need to work harder.
Right.
That's how I think about performance science.
No, I think it's fascinating because, the work I'm doing is researching resilience in startup company leaders. So in specifically how leaders overcame the COVID pandemic, right? The startup companies that sort of ran into brick walls in the early part of their businesses. And some small businesses thrived and others fell apart. And so I'm looking at the resilient feature, the resilience of those leaders. But what's interesting is, if I look at those four things, they all apply to leading a company through a very difficult time, especially as a new company, as a small, young company where you don't have the resources to maybe absorb a large external event like a COVID pandemic. But it's strategy focus, it's execution, it's how do you influence your group of people when you have these, this wave of bad news coming at you and either lockdowns or supply chain challenges or what have you. But then it's the mindset and staying motivated through that and not losing hope and staying focused. And then, of course, the biology piece, like what's happening to your body as you're stressed out and not sleeping and thinking about things. So all these things, the work that I'm doing, sort of these fit into the buckets of things that I'm looking at with respect to how did startup leaders, to survive the pandemic and thrive in the midst of chaos. And so it's very interesting. So it makes a lot of sense that this is part of performance science.
Yeah. And I love that was a perfect example to say there's a lot of different scenarios where it can be a useful tool, right? Even if you're saying, okay, as a new startup without a lot of resources, what are the different things we can look at when we start to say, how do we weather something like a pandemic? And And then from a coaching standpoint, one of the fun things about coaching from a performance science lens, and different coaches think about this differently. But there's the thought of being a coach where you're like, there's no giving of advice. It's all about like helping the person you coach find like their answers and pave the path for themselves. And like, I have a little bit of a different view on that from coaching. And I think it's wonderful to have a mix of views in a space because that's what produces innovation. It can also produce interesting discussions. But from my standpoint, when I looked at like all these different things I had pursued in my life and when I was learning and didn't like, for example, I started playing ultimate Frisbee when, I guess in a little bit in undergrad, but then mostly during grad school. And I was very new. I was very athletic. I had rowed crew in college. I had been a distance runner in high school. So very athletic, but hadn't really played a field sport like that. And one of the interesting things is when you're trying to come up that curve really quickly, I found that there were multiple things that you might actually need to improve your performance. Now, some of it is stuff you have to figure out for yourself. And I would say this is also true, like when I did my PhD, this was true of medical school. There are some things that don't have a best practice or where there's a really important answer that resonates to a person or to their values. And I think it is very important as a coach that one of the roles you play is like as a thought partner to help them get clarity, to ask good questions and help people find that. But I also know that people who are doing really challenging things, that all of us don't always have all the information. And sometimes there are really important like practices or ideas that can be powerful. This is one of the reasons why like reading is, but now we can even say YouTube or like just the content that we have access to think about a new way of doing something. Like for example, if you are a CEO and no one in your family was a CEO, in my case, it was I was training to be a doctor and no one in my family was a doctor. So I didn't have those conversations at home at the dinner table with mom and dad. And but from my standpoint with coaching, I think it's really nice to have both the respect for, is this a question someone needs to answer for themselves, but also to identify like resources or ideas that would be powerful if presented to a person who is in the right situation and like to consider it. And sometimes the power of an idea is even in that person saying, nope, that's not the right idea for me right now. As can be as powerful as saying, I hadn't thought about networking in that way. Now we have transformed my mindset around going out and meeting people, which is very important for my startup because I am doing a fundraise and I need to wrap my head around that. So I think this is one of the things I liked about performance science was it also gave an industry agnostic set of tools and ideas that were not so prescriptive that you were taking away someone's ability to take that idea and make it their own. Because again, like I'm not in my client's industry, but instead you could bring great tools and ideas and then you could say, what is true about that? What would be useful about that for you? What isn't? And I really like that balance in coaching. Again, different perspective than some other coaches take, but it's good to have different perspectives in a field.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think that, the traditional, one of the things I struggled with learning was like the difference between a mentor and a coach. And whereas a mentor is like an experience, someone who's been through what you're trying to go through and just help guide you and shows you. And then your coach is more helps you sort of self-learn some of the concepts and what have you. You're saying, you're doing the coaching, but also giving information that's going to help that person achieve. So giving them resources and ideas and techniques that can actually help them along their journey. So to move a little faster down the self-learning, highway by giving them ideas and resources. So it's like a coaching plus, kind of program. Is that a good way to look at it?
Yeah, I think it's just the acknowledgement of to perform at a high level and to be on a learning curve, we often need, and this is even mid-career, I'm not just talking about like when we're early career, but even mid-career, like we need different things. And so for me, part of the the art of coaching is to say, can you be really versatile in terms of both being able to ask, but also be willing to switch within modes to say what would be most helpful for this person in this moment. And again, the nice thing is when you're not in someone's field, and because performance science isn't referring to one field or another one, it still will require interpretation for that person to translate it to their experience. And because you're not translating it for them, they don't lose out on the experience of growing, of making it their own, but they get the plus. I like it. Coaching plus.
Yeah, that's what it seems like to me. And I love that. So we have a lot of listeners that are listening in who, they live in, every day they're leading teams of people trying to do difficult things. What are some of the principles that leaders who are listening can take away from these ideas of performance science to really help them lead their teams, develop their teams, motivate their teams? What are some takeaway ideas that they can learn from performance science?
Well, I think there's probably like 2 or 3 big ones. I think one of the first most important things, and I often do start with strategy because I believe if we can set ourselves up to win from the start, everything else goes way better. Right. And the thing I often think about with strategy is for a leader to help lead their team and even motivate their team, I think it is really important to be clear and have some mental clarity around what are we aiming at and what is most important for us to be focusing like our time on. And the story that from very early in my coaching that reminds me of this continually is that it's very important for a leader, partially for their well-being as a leader, to feel like even if they're showing up and having to fight some fires, that they have that clarity for themselves and can kind of think down the road. But the really surprising thing about how this impacts teams is that, so I had a leader, and we often will build kind of a strategic framework when we start working together where I ask a lot of questions and help them define their goal and what's most important, like priorities. And one of the interesting things was we built that framework, and this leader took it back to their team and showed it to them. And was totally open about it. And the team asked a lot of questions about it. And then the team was like, hey, I see where I fit in. That's my priority. Like, I'm totally focused on that. Or I'm contributing to these two. And they started to sort of be able to paint their roles into where they fit in.
Yeah.
And then they were so excited. They were like, we want our own frameworks. Like, we want that clarity. And to me, what was interesting, I never worked with the team. I only do like one-on-one coaching with leaders. But the team, he came back and told me, like, the team was so fired up. And this is when I started to learn and see the connection between focus, or like having clarity about your strategy first in your own head, because you have to have it in your own head before you can communicate it to your team. Yeah. And that when teams understand how to win, and when they understand how they are contributing, because they can see their own contributions mapping back to what's most important and to the goal, that is a very powerful motivator. And so this is where you can see like one bucket, like a strategy bucket, impacting what we might say is the psychology or the mindset bucket in a really interesting way. You could also argue that to execute well, it's really important for your team to understand what they need to do. Like where do they fit in? What's most important? So I first tool, like this is, and the tool really, because people say, okay, great, I can see why that's important, but what do I do? I think one of the most important tools of focus is to give yourself some time to think as a leader. Not just react, but like some time to like think down the board a little bit. And you can ask yourself 3 questions, like over and over and over again. Like, what are we trying to do? Has it changed? Has it shifted? Is it the same? Can I articulate it really clearly, not in kind of a vague sense, but like put some words to it? What do we think is most important for us to be contributing to? And then the third question is, what is extraneous or could be really distracting to us? Like, what are the kinds of things other companies are doing that we might get sucked into, but that really aren't our strength? Like, but we could kind of start wasting some resources or time on those things. So that last question, what's extraneous? What are we not going to do? Can be really powerful too. So
It's really interesting. I mean, what you talk about in terms of strategy is sort of having a clear path. And I think that's really important. And I see a lot of leaders missing out on that. Like, everything is important, right? And so nothing is important. And so it gets distracting. But one of the things that, I teach undergraduate students, and we were talking about strategic leadership this morning. And so one of the things I said to them was, as a leader, we get ideas from all our stakeholders, whether you're talking to customers, we're talking internal stakeholders, our employees, and we're getting a sense of all the things that are important to the business. But I think what really comes down to in the leader is like you said, taking that time, digesting all of those inputs. But then our job is to move the rudder in a certain direction. So to say, all right, I've taken all this input, right, and from what I can tell, the best path forward is this path, and then being very clear to communicate that path to your team, so that, as you said, their mindsets are right. Like, okay, this is where I fit into this journey. And they're able to execute well because the path is clear. This is where we're going. This is where we're heading. This is why we're heading there. And I think that's one of the things that you can't take away from leadership is that we have to make a decision as to where to steer the ship. You have to have your hand on the tiller and you have to move the rudder and you have to communicate that this is the direction we're headed. Otherwise, there's chaos, right? And the path isn't clear. And everything's important. So I really love how you started with strategy and making the path clear.
Well, and just to comment on that, I love the ship analogy because there's a couple of things that we can learn from that. And one of them is that, number one, you know this because of your background, the rudder does nothing unless there's water going over going past the rudder, right? You got to be moving. And so I think sometimes people hear this and they think, this is like a sequence thing where I sit down, I do some time, I figure it all out, I tell my team, and then we just go. And of course, having been on a boat, that's not how sailing works. That's not how a lot of steering a boat works. There have to be constant adjustments. And so it tells us that this thinking time and even strategy and focus is something we loop on over time. So I often say it's a practice of saying block some time for yourself as a leader to make sure you can check in with those questions and see if the answers have changed. Maybe you have more nuance because now you started with an idea and a direction, but now you've learned some things because you've actually tested it with the market. And so you can get more nuanced answers. And so I love the ship analogy because you often have to get going before you can steer, but then you can be sort of adjusting along the way.
Well, it's interesting you say that because the truth of the matter is, if anyone who's listening in knows anything about boats, is you actually can't steer if you don't have velocity, right? You need speed, to be able to turn driving a submarine is very difficult because we have one propeller and one rudder. And so if you get below a certain speed, that big lumbering giant would not turn. So we had to be going fast, which was also dangerous because we would operate in narrow channels. We had to run fast and steer correctly. And so I think I love the idea of it's an iterative process and you're going to be making corrections along the way. And I think especially, what's most important with respect to strategy is executing and getting that feedback and then making the course corrections along the way to make sure that we're not just going down a path because we decided to 5 years ago. We're getting all the input. Are the customers liking what we're doing? Do we need to make some changes? What will make this even better? And I know as a startup leader, as startup CEO, we've the company I operate today is not the company I started with 9 years ago. We've moved in many different directions to find our optimum place in the world, and I think that's what leaders have to do in running these businesses, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love it. In your personal experience, you're like, I can just say that is true. In fact, then you were like, doing a sub, you have to go fast and course correct a lot. I was like, that sounds like a startup. Because these are mixing too. So, and you got to steer as carefully as you can. But yeah, it's a great analogy.
Right, because you're your room for error is very small. The same thing with a startup company. You don't have a lot of resources. If things go really bad quickly, you're out of business, right? And so, so you're all constantly making course corrections. I love this idea. I love the idea of performance science, and I love the idea of how we can apply these in our leadership journey. This has been a really good conversation. What's like an idea, like a final message that we could leave with all of our listeners based on what we talked about today?
Oh, this is, so many different things I could say here. I think one idea I love to think about, this is also with regards to like teams and leadership and performance science, is that, we have a lot of uncertainty out there. And as you pointed out, in a startup. So I think one last piece, and this is a little bit, has to do with execution and influence, but is how we think as leaders about developing our teams and helping them learn how to learn. Like how to be on their own learning and developmental journeys, and that this is a really important role of a leader for their teams. And so my final thought on this is just a lot of uncertainty in the environment and the markets. What it reveals to us is a gap between what we know right now and what we might need to know to be successful. And so I just think this is a theme that is true today, maybe more than it ever has been. And so it's a thing I always like to bring up with leaders, that part of how we can use performance science is to say, great, what are areas where we could help our team members build their capacity, help them get started learning something, identifying something that would be worth learning, and keep going on it and having it really tie back to something that matters for the team, for the company. But that's a totally new thought, I know, but I think it's something really important for just some of the uncertainty in the journeys we're all on.
I love that. I love that. That's a big part of what we have to do as leaders, help our employees develop and reach their full potential, whatever that might be, to the things that they want to do in their careers and their lives. So I think that's a great piece of advice to wrap this up. Carla, how can listeners find out more about you and the services you offer?
So a great place to learn more about my coaching is at my website, and that is at thaxa.com, THAXA. And but I'm always talking about performance science, and we hit some great topics today, but there's so much. And so if anyone in the audience is interested, wants to hear more, I'm always posting these conversations on LinkedIn. So you can follow along there, and we'll make sure that's in the show notes. And then but I also have all my episodes that I've been on with different hosts, different kinds of conversations are on my website as well. So again, if you want to geek out on performance science, there are resources for you.
I love that. And it's interesting, before we wrap up, like who should get a coach? What type of person, what type of leader should be hiring a coach?
I think there's so many reasons, different reasons, and this is great. And there are different coaches who could be a great fit. But sometimes you have an acute pain point, you have a problem, and it is so nice to have a thought partner, to not have to do it alone, to have a confidential, foil thought partner to help you get clarity. So we talked about getting clarity is a practice. You need some dedicated time for it. And for some people, we should think on our own, but also sometimes it's really useful to dialogue, right? Mm-hmm. Have someone ask questions. So that's one example. But I also know that sometimes people really benefit from a coach when it's not that there's a problem, but they want to be really deliberate about how are they investing in themselves? How are they growing? Because they know that our environments often push us towards what is most comfortable for us. And so sometimes it's really helpful to have a partner where you are working on how you are trying to learn and grow as a leader. And so maybe not because you have an acute pain point, but precisely because you don't have pain you're addressing, it could be really easy to just kind of keep doing things the way you're doing it. And that's a whole different reason. But
I love that. And again, listeners, get a coach. I highly recommend it. I'm a CEO. I've been leading people for 30 years, and I have a CEO coach. I do coach other CEOs as well. But I highly recommend having that person that in your life that's not in your chain of command, that you can bounce ideas off of and help you get clarity. It's super important. My coach is helping me just have my best year ever in my company. in trying to be the best CEO I can be. And I highly recommend. And so if you like what Carla is talking about, again, follow these links. They're in the show notes and connect up with Carla and have a conversation with her. If you're looking for a coach, she's available, and she can coach you and help you become the absolute best leader you can be and being a high-performing leader. We need more high-performing leaders in this world. So get yourself a coach, talk to Carla, follow the links in the show notes. I highly recommend reaching out to her, and she's going to help you along your journey. Carla, I want to thank you for coming on the show, sharing all your expertise and your story of how you got into this performance process. But I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, John. This was fun.
Thank you again. Well, that is it for today. Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share so we can continue to build a world with better bosses. Until next time, this is John Rennie saying take care and lead well.
Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you for all you do.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. For more information and updates, please visit our website at www.deepleadershippodcast.com or johnsrennie.com. Until next time, take care.
Everyone has heard about the U.S. space program, but what is actually going on at NASA? Get the real story in 4 minutes or less with the NASA Daily Podcast from Electricast. Join astronauts and researchers as they conduct groundbreaking experiments, work on the International Space Station, and reach for the stars. NASA Daily, your cosmic update.
Electricast. Hi, I'm Sherilyn Fenn from Twin Peaks. What did you do on your last Saturday night?
Did you hear something?
Toilet paper.
There's nada. The reserves have gone dry. People are hoarding it. I should have done that.
They're all out of hand sanitizer at my Target.
Mark, when did you last watch the news?
We are getting reports of forced quarantines in China, Japan, and now Italy.
You're cutting onions in half and putting them around your apartment.
Yes, exactly. It kills the COVID.
Excuse me?
Let's go. Get in.
Vamos, rápido.
Have you ever driven one of these?
Never.
I'll drive, ladies.
I've got the keys.
Excuse me, I'm lost. I'm looking for my wife. I got turned around.
Join me, Eric Roberts, Jennifer Elise Cox, and Ed Asner for The Last Saturday Night, an Electricast podcast. You'll love it.
Electricast.